Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about friend functions. Friend functions are not member functions, but they do have access to private member variables. So sometimes you want to have a function that can access the private member variables, but it is not a member function. And this is how you create these friend functions. All right, so here's an example of a friend function. We have this class day of year, and we will define our friend function in the interface of, or the definition, as a prototype as part of our function. The definition or the implementation of this function can be anywhere in our program as long as it has access to the declaration of our class. So in the declaration of our class here, we declare the prototype of this friend function. This is not a member function. However, this friend function will be able to access the private member variables. So let's look at the example how this works. So we have this class day of year, and we have some functions in here. All of these functions, these are the constructors, and these functions right here are the member functions. And these are the private member variables, month and day. So the class day of year is very simple. It has a month and a day, numeric month and a numeric day. Obviously the day is numeric, but the month, 1 for January, 2 for February. And we have these functions that when you declare an object of your class, you use your member functions to do things with your class. Well, sometimes here we have this friend function. This friend function is going to determine if 2 days of the year are equal. And if we use it as a friend function, it can actually, by using the dot operator, it can access the 2 private member variables. So here is an example of how you implement the member functions. Remember, when you implement the member functions, you use what's called the scope resolution operator. That is the scope resolution operator. Right there, those 2 colons. So when you're using classes, you have 2 things that you use. One is the scope resolution operator, which is used when you write the definitions or the implementation of your class functions, the body, the block of code in which you implement your class member functions. The other thing that you use with classes is the dot operator, which you should be very familiar with. So these are 2 member functions. So you use the name of the class, the return type, the name of the class, the scope resolution operator, and the name of the function. And this output function is a constant function because it does not manipulate or change the variables inside the function. Here's an example of the friend function. So this is a friend function. It's called equal, and it takes 2 days of the year, 2 day of year objects. Those are the formal parameters, and what it does is it tests to see if the month and the day of both of those days of the year match, and if they do, it will return true, and if they don't, it will not return true. So because this is a friend function, you can see by just using the dot operator, it can access the private member variables, month and day. Now let's take a look at what would happen if we did not use it as a friend function. So here we have a class day of year, and this class day of year does not have a friend function called equal. This class day of year just has all of the other functions that are available, the input, output, and it has the accessor functions. So these are the accessor functions. What these functions do is they return the get month function in the implementation. It just returns the month, and the get day function will return the date. So these are accessor functions, and if this equal function right here is not a friend function, it cannot access the month and the day directly, it has to use the accessor functions in order to get the month and the date. So instead of doing checking if date 1 dot month equals date 2 dot month, you have to use the accessor function get month and the accessor function get day in order to access the private member variables. So here, as a friend function, it's different. Now that it's a friend function, it can access these variables directly. And I still would include the accessor functions. Actually, with all of your private member variables, if you want to have a complete class, you should always include accessor and mutator functions for all your private member variables. Because this is a class, and if we're focusing on one thing at a time, I removed some of that content just to make things easier to read and make things a little bit shorter. But if you were to make the class the correct way, you should always include accessor and mutator functions for all of your private member variables. So I'm going to write that down. In a class, you should always include accessor and mutator functions for all your private member variables. And for our class, for our course, that should make sense to you. You should completely understand what I just wrote there. And if you don't, you need to go back and read chapter 10 and look at the videos for chapter 10 and look at the notes for chapter 10, because you should understand what a private member variable is, and you should understand what an accessor and a mutator function are, and obviously you should know how to create a class. All right, so now I got to erase all that so you guys can see here. All right, so here's our friend function. We already did this, but just as a refresher, this function has been set up to be a friend of the day of your class. So since it is a friend of the day of your class, we do not put the scope resolution operator, we do not put the name of the class. We implement it just like any other normal function that's not part of a class, but because it's listed here, it does have access to the private member variables, so we can use the dot operator to access the private member variables. Here is just to remind you, if we did not include this, as a friend, then we would have to implement it this way by using the accessor functions. Accessor functions just mean that function provides access to the private member variables. Because if you are not a friend function or you are not a member function, you cannot access the private member variables directly. If you are a member function, you do not need to use any kind of dot operator to access the private member variables. They are part of your class, and you just use them without any kind of operator, which you can go over. That was in chapter 10.